Now, we want you to join us on a journey to the underbelly of our community as we embark on a new series. We call it TriState True Crime. And it takes a look at the darker, more sinister side of Cincinnati history. We've tapped nationally recognized historian Bob Batchelor to help us research these topics. You may have seen him on the show before, and our first story is about the Rookwood Pottery Mad Man. So, without further ado, TriState True Crime.
We don't usually associate the beauty of Rookwood pottery with attempted murder or suicide, but that is exactly what happened on a sunny summer morning, August 8, 1888, when the sound of gunshots rang through Rookwood's original factory at 207 Eastern Avenue. Just 8 years after being founded by Maria Longworth Storer, Rookwood was regarded as America's best art pottery. Englishman William Auckland deserved a great deal of the credit. He shaped and molded all of Rookwood's handmade artwork on his spinning wheel with his own hands. Auckland also designed many of the shapes. His daughters Jenny and Fanny had also worked at Rookwood. Fanny was so gifted that she began at 12 and worked directly with Maria. Auckland was skilled but described by other employees as insulting and caustic. He liked to play mean-spirited tricks on his colleagues, jokes that ended with sarcastic comments and name-calling. One afternoon, engineer Albert Fryer bore the brunt of Auckland's profanity-laced tirade through the pottery's internal tube, a communication system that enabled different parts of the building to talk to one another. The next morning, Fryer reported Auckland to Joseph Bailey, Rookwood superintendent, then confronted Auckland in his office. Without saying a word, Auckland leapt from his bench, grabbed a .38 caliber bulldog pistol concealed in his lunchbox, the same kind of gun, by the way, carried by Custer at Little Bighorn and used to assassinate President James Garfield. He fired at Fryer from point-blank range. Remarkably, the startled Fryer turned as the bullet tore through his shirt, resulting in a flesh wound rather than certain death. The engineer fled out the front door and up Eastern Avenue. Bailey, who had been standing nearby, screamed, "Don't you shoot, Fryer." Auckland yelled back, "I'll shoot you." Bailey ran down steps towards the kilns. Auckland chased him, firing twice, but both shots missed. Bailey, a big man over 6 feet tall and barrel-chested, used his body to barricade the kiln room door. However, there was a window that looked into that room. Auckland stuck his arm through the opening and fired at Bailey, hitting him in the left side near the shoulder. Then, without a word, Auckland placed the barrel 1 inch from his own right temple and pulled the trigger. Auckland lay in a pool of blood when the police arrived. He was rushed to City Hospital. 2 doctors were summoned, and they took Bailey to a residence at the back of the factory. They saved his life, but never found the bullet, still somewhere in his body. Amazingly, Fryer went home, had his wound bandaged, then returned to work later that afternoon. Called Rookwood's murderous maniac, newspapers across the region and nation reported on the crime. Rookwood employees said Auckland, quote, was not all right in his mind, close quote. Albert Valentine, one of Rookwood's most famous artists, was an eyewitness, telling the press Auckland fell, the blood splashing over him and the floor. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported that the shooter's brain matter has been oozing, but that he somehow recovered enough to fly into a violent delirium that required 5 hospital attendants to restrain him. Auckland lived for 12 days before dying. The artist never explained himself or his murderous intent. He is buried in Spring Grove Cemetery.
And with us now is the Duke of Darkness, cultural historian Bob Batchelor. Bob, thanks so much for joining us now on this new series and, volunteering to be labeled the Duke of Darkness.
Thanks, Clyde.
Sure. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a cultural historian. I've written several books, including one on 1920s bootleg King George Remus, a recent book on Rookwood's 140th year history, and a true crime aficionado. So glad to be here today to bring this really crazy true crime story to life.
All right, so let's delve a little bit more into Rookwood's Mad Man, as he's somewhat known. Has your research uncovered any clues about what it was that launched Auckland into this crime in the first place?
Well, as you mentioned in the piece, his coworkers really did feel that he had some mental problems, that he was insane. What my research revealed is that on a larger level, Rookwood was preparing for its first International World's Fair competition that would happen a year later in 1889. And he had to be under intense pressure because he threw all the hand-thrown pieces. Also, when I dug a little deeper into his past, I found out he had 3 children die in the previous 2 years. 2 were in childbirth, essentially, and 1 was as a 1-year-old. Now, this was much more a part of everyday life, unfortunately, for people in the late 1800s. But if you take those things together, I think that might help. I mean, mental health is a difficult issue to deal with even today.
Sure.
And I think today he would have got some help, hopefully, and not gone into this rampage. People said he was paranoid, and that's where this fear came from.
Okay. All right. Well, you talked about his kids, those who deceased, but let's talk for a moment about his daughter, Fanny, who was also an artist. What became of her?
Well, Fanny was a child prodigy. She began at Rookwood at 12 and worked basically at Rookwood from 12 to 16. Then, interestingly, she became almost like a circus performer, demonstrating how to actually make hand-thrown clay. Because at this time, in the late 1800s and then into the 1890s, women weren't thought to be able to have the physical dexterity to make clay. So I started digging around, and she went by the name either Madame Kaolini or Queen Kaolini. And kaolin is a type of clay that we would associate with like China. And that was her skill. She was able to incise, make little grooves and 3D imagery in those pieces. And she even worked with Mariah Longworth Storer on many pieces that ended up in museums. So she traveled around the country. I found an advertisement of her at in New Orleans at a dime museum. And Cincinnati, these were like P.T. Barnum kind of museums for the lower classes and blue-collar classes to become educated and entertained.
Sure, sure. Wow, fascinating indeed. So if people want to connect with you, how do they do that?
Well, it's easiest by my website. It's just my name. I'm also on Twitter, which is bobbatchelor.com, and all over Facebook. So I'm pretty easy to connect with. So if viewers have a true crime story, particularly in their family, and they want me to explore that for the next segment, please, by all means, drop me a line.
Oh, wow.
We'll have fun with this.
Now there's a challenge. Bob, thanks so much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you, Clyde. Great to be here.
Yes, sir. Mona?